Propaganda. I love a good propaganda. The first video I ever made was about propaganda. It's been around for a while, and it used to be very tasteful and artistic. Look at this stuff. It's pretty sweet, right? Well, propaganda started out pretty simple. Pamphlets, flyers, posters, all generally straightforward too. There was simplicity to it. It was nice. But unfortunately, time went on and technology improved, and, well, propaganda improved too. Not in the sense of how it looked artistically, but rather how effective and discreet it was. And before we knew it, we had US military propaganda targeting children. Well, actually, let's back up there for a second, shall we? This isn't anything new, so to say. The US military actually had quite the resume of propagandizing its youth. But the definition of child gets more murky the further back we go. Let's jump way far back, let's say the 1910s. You're an American boy living in the rural countryside of Virginia. Life is pretty straightforward. Though you are only 16, you live a fairly mature lifestyle. You already finished school 2 years ago, and you work at the local grocery store. You've heard talks of a war raging in Europe. One day, good old Bobby Smith comes out to the store and says, "Gee, Tommy, I heard the army's going to fight Jerry and help out our European allies. Word is that it's going to be a cakewalk, a simple occupying force. We get to see the world for free and help out while doing it. What do you say? Let's go join the army." The next day, you and Bobby Smith enlist in the army, faking your age, but the army men don't seem to care. You're a strapping young buck. You go through boot camp, meet people from across the country, and before you know it, all your friends are dead in a trench in France. You have trench foot every time you fall asleep. Rats try eating your eyes, and you can't hear anything because of the constant shelling, and you're permanently scarred both physically and mentally for the rest of your life. This was the experience of roughly 250,000 American teenagers during the First World War. A few decades later, in World War II, roughly 300,000 American teenage boys under the age of 18 would also serve, some with parental consent. Why did this happen? Or even how did this happen? As I alluded to before, the concept of the teenager still was a newer social construct in many ways. Children of the early 1900s very much acted like adults. They dressed like adults. They smoked like adults. They worked in factories and mines and stores like adults. They, of course, had limitations and some protections, but as you know, they were limited. According to author Neil Postman in his book The Disappearance of Childhood, the social role of the teenager wasn't largely recognized until the mid-1940s. The widespread institutionalization of a prolonged education coupled with divisions in literacy capabilities between older and younger Americans gave rise to the idea of the teenager still falling closer to childhood rather than adulthood. So, by the social standards and expectations of the time, the US military wasn't technically propagandizing children of the era, but rather, as Postman called them, smaller, imperfect forms of adults. But, let's be real here, they were still kids. For a while, the propagandization of Americans would stop to a degree, officially, with the passing of the 1948 Smith-Mundt Modernization Act. This made it illegal for the government to expose the domestic population to taxpayer-funded propaganda that was targeted at foreign audiences. But, as I said, it was only limited to a degree. America, and by extension the Western world, had found themselves in a new conflict after World War II. One that wasn't a raging war, but decades worth of subversion. The Cold War. Though there weren't any bullets fired between America and the then Soviet Union, the prowess and power of each military was apparent in the ever-looming constant threat of nuclear obliteration and the return of an all-out war. And the US government was damn aware of this too, and made sure to make the entire population know it as well. A book titled Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitudes by, probably going to say his name wrong, but Jacques Ellul, lays out in easy-to-understand terms how propaganda works. Propaganda is a lot more than just posters or speeches. It's a complex environment that utilizes media, education, entertainment, and even consumer products in order to shape how people think and act. While there is the easy-to-identify overt political propaganda spouted directly from the party, this form is generally less effective in the free Western world, as most people can see where these messages come from and how they aim to influence them. On the other hand, there is sociological propaganda, which is much more convoluted, expansive, and sinister. It utilizes a society's overall culture to subtly influences people's habits, beliefs, and values without the person being aware of the influence. This is primarily achieved through advertising, media, education, social norms, entertainment, and really, honestly, just about anything. It would be this form that would become the standard mechanism for spreading U.S. military propaganda for children in the post-war era. Speaking on very broad terms, there wasn't much need for the government to propagandize their own citizens so intensely in the decades directly following World War II. The narrative of American supremacy on all fronts was widely upheld by its own population. People believed in the cause, so to say. There wasn't much point in questioning government institutions, especially the military, when seemingly every action and campaign carried out by them was in the name of American virtue. But this isn't to say that children weren't being propagandized even at this point. In order to uphold the narrative of American military virtue, children must be introduced to it from a young age. Even today, World War II is taught in a very good versus evil style of narrative, and there is validity in this, but something that is sure to never be mentioned is the vast amount of war crimes carried out by Americans, particularly on the Western Front against the Japanese. The use of nuclear weapons on civilian populations in Japan was a war crime. But to phrase it as such would invalidate the narrative of absolute virtue the U.S. military had developed in the wartime and directly post-war. So this is where propaganda steps in. The use of nuclear bomb was taught, and in many cases is still taught, as a case of necessity. It was the only way. This topic has been debated by historians for decades, some following the narrative of necessity while others have disagreed. Regardless, this example can be tied back to the overarching idea of sociological propaganda and its subtle. Again, to generalize, the 2 decades immediately following World War II, the uses of sociological propaganda was more subtle overall, as I explained prior. I also want to clarify that for the sake of time, I will not go into every detail or instance of propaganda, or this video would be 10,000 hours long, which I do not have the patience to make. To put it bluntly, people were questioning the war. People were questioning the military's actions on a scale that had never been witnessed before in the United States. Hunter, Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and Rambo First Blood, all of which carried heavy anti-war sentiments and were released generally quick from the end of the war in 1975. But the one that struck me in particular was Rambo First Blood. When most people think of Rambo, they generally think of a roided-up, super buff, unstoppable army commando. But that's not what Rambo was. First Blood tells the tale of a Vietnam veteran who can't find peace in his homeland and is mentally scarred from the war. He's pushed to his limits by the government and institutions at home, the very government and institutions that he fought and killed to protect. Rambo is a veteran with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It was a condition that wasn't identified until the late 1980s. Prior to this research, soldiers who had suffered from the condition had been told they were suffering from shell shock, a term coined by a World War I British Royal Army psychiatrist who believed it was a result of physical damage to the head, i.e. concussions, and it was not viewed as seriously as a mental condition. First Blood was widely successful upon its release. It was one of the first movies to seriously tackle how PTSD affected veterans of war, and there would be many more Rambos to come out after. Maybe a little too many Rambos to come out after, all of which had a very different plot though. Rambo, who only fought because he felt he had the need to in the first movie, would return to Vietnam to save his American POW brothers. He was still the same unstoppable, roided-up army commando, but now without the PTSD. Now, I'm not saying that the government instructed Hollywood to make these movies, but the subversion is obvious. Rambo, originally a character that critiqued the U.S. military, had basically become G.I. Joe for adults, and a caricature of how the U.S. military would have liked their soldiers to have appeared in Vietnam. The reason I highlight Rambo as a franchise is that its thematic progression mirrors the 1980s U.S. military propaganda for children. At this point, the Vietnam conflict had created a gaping hole in the myth of the U.S. military absolute virtue. They could no longer just have the military men be perfect. They had to be more in order to win over the minds of the youth. They had to be cool. The 1980s saw a more widespread return to pro-military themes across the general public and in children's media. The number one proponent of the U.S. military for children in the 1980s was the IP G.I. Joe. G.I. Joe had originally been created in the mid-60s by the Hasbro company after seeing the success of the Barbie doll amongst young girls. Hasbro sought to replicate the success in a younger boy audience, consulting with the U.S. government for authenticity's sake to create a superhero-like action figure called G.I. Joe. Originally, G.I. Joe was just a simple army man action figure, but due to the brand's popular success, the IP would expand across different forms of media, notably into comic books and television directed exclusively at children. G.I. Joe, a real American hero, depicted a group of American military special forces from across all branches fighting against the evil terror group Cobra. A simple story for children, yes, but with a simple underlying propagandistic message as well. It was good versus evil, and you know who the good guys were. They were always there to fight evil and protect the world. The good guys were the American military. And it wasn't just the 1980s Transformers cartoon depicted the good guys, Autobots, teaming up with the American military on several occasions in order to defeat the villainous Decepticons, another case of the American military on the side of pure good. Though not directly made for children, the original A-Team series, which depicted a team of ex-Special Forces Vietnam soldiers, was very popular amongst teenagers of the time. And of course, I can't talk about military propaganda from the 80s without talking about Top Gun. Upon its release, it had a PG rating, and it resulted in a 500% increase in Navy recruitment. Now, I'd like to take a second here and clear some unanswered questions I'm sure you're thinking, dear viewer. How are these propaganda? I thought propaganda had to be made from the party. Political propaganda, yes, but sociological propaganda does not. According to Alul, sociological propaganda does not have to come directly from a party or a government or even a conscious propagandist, and that's what makes this form the most dangerous. People don't recognize this form as propaganda at all, rather they view it as its own entity. In the case of these children's shows with the military themes, parents aren't apt to suspect them of being overt propaganda because inherently they're not. Rather, they are sociological, but still feeding a narrative to children in their earliest developmental phases, with that message being one of pro-US military sentiments. Think that 10 years prior, in the early 70s, many children of the same age were exposed to a strong nationwide anti-war sentiment that influenced their overall opinions on the US military well into adulthood. 10 years later, some of the most popular children's media had returned to depicting the US military in a literally cartoonishly positive light. How does this affect kids? Well, think of the implications. Kids might aspire to join the army from a young age to be just like G.I. Joe. They may go into adulthood having underlying pro-US military point of views due to the years spent playing with military action figures. So when a new war breaks out, soldiers are returning home with PTSD, and it's unclear why the US is fighting overseas in a little-known country, while those same kids who are now adults may be less inclined to gather at anti-war protests. The 90s and early 2000s would see a decline in the popularity of military-related children's media. There were still comic books and the occasional movie, but marketing directly at children had decreased a bit. This may be due to several wars the United States waged during that era, which were unpopular amongst people of the US, thus discouraging toy makers. But the late 2000s would see a strange shift in the way sociological propaganda would affect children. Whereas in the past, the US government had very little to no involvement in the production of military-themed products for children, that would start to shift. To start, there were the Transformers, again. This time, directed by Michael Bay. The first two movies featured, to be frank, a weird amount of US military assets from personnel to locations to vehicles, really everything the military could possibly offer a movie about CGI giant robots. Now, there actually are a weird amount of movies that basically just portray the US military kicking space aliens' asses, and the military is always portrayed as super smart and in control and the absolute victors with all of their top-of-the-line equipment on display in these movies. Well, these movies are not officially made by the US military, but they sure do like them. In order to gain access to the abundant arsenal of war machines the US military has to offer, production companies must sign something called a PAA, Production Assistance Agreement. What this states is that the studio can use the military's equipment and locations in exchange for money, but also only if the US military is portrayed in a positive light. To be clear, these have existed for a very long time, but really the most notable one that felt like overt propaganda was Top Gun back in the 80s. We just started getting a flurry of pro-US military regulated media throughout the late 2000s and early 2010s. In fact, these PEAs existed in much more than just movies. For example, in 2012, Katy Perry, who at the time was extremely popular, filmed a video in which she signed up to be a Marine, with the help and support of the Marines in real life, of course. And we can't forget one of the bigger elephants in the room either: video games. There's always been a lot of controversies over video games. Some parents have claimed they have caused violence in their kids, but what's really shocking is that no one, not once, stopped and went, "Is it weird that our children are playing a military simulator that's a Michael Bay propaganda film turned into a game?" Not once. And oh boy, they've been at this for a while. In fact, the military's been making US military propaganda in the form of video games since Doom. The US military saw the success of Doom and how many people liked it and played it, and as a result, it would make their first ever government-issued video game. Marine Doom. Yes, this is just Doom skinned over with Marine stuff. Genius, right? The DoD would also consult the Call of Duty franchise in their early days, telling them what weapons to use, aiding in their storyboard direction, and who the Americans were fighting against. Actually, Call of Duty is one of the only video games that people have criticized as being a military recruitment platform. The characters in the early games were G.I. Joe level American super soldiers. The Americans were always the good guys, and I mean, come on. One of the last missions in Modern Warfare 2 is fighting Russian soldiers for the White House back as you play as a Marine. If that's not propaganda, then I'm stupid. The U.S. Army also sponsored Call of Duty esports tournaments until 2021. In fact, the DoD and COD's connections run so deep that one of Call of Duty's story writers quit his job at Activision to work for the DoD as a quote-unquote unknown conflicts advisor, whatever that means. But the U.S. military didn't just stop at advising popular first-person shooters on the plot lines and the weaponry. They went full steam ahead and just made their own first-person shooter. America's Army initially released in 2002, and it was a raw children's propaganda in video game form. The game allowed for players to simulate being an American soldier in a tactical first-person shooter, and it wasn't just some trash game no one ever played, like Blackwater's military simulator. Instead, over the course of American Army's lifespan, it released 8 different games across multiple different platforms and achieved a grand total player count of 250 million in tons of accolades from various gaming sites. I was too young to ever play these games, but from what I can see, the early versions were actually pretty good. I guess the government can do some stuff right. But what sets these apart as a real piece of propaganda for kids? Well, to start, there was the messaging. The game was obviously pro-military. It promoted the U.S. Army's 7 core values. It had missions where you played as quote-unquote real American heroes, reenacting dramatized versions of modern-day war heroes. But something that stands out to me were the ratings and the pricing. Whereas many other popular first-person shooters of the time were rated M, so a child couldn't buy it alone, and had hefty pricing, America's Army was rated T for teen, and it was free. The game was criticized as an outright recruiting tool, but the US Army's response was even better. They basically just said, yeah, it is. Upon its release, the game was branded as a strategic communication device designed to allow Americans to virtually explore the Army at their own pace. It allowed them to determine whether becoming a soldier fit their interests and abilities. It doesn't get any more outright than that. Now, much of the content I've discussed has been sociological propaganda, but this piece of media stands alone as an outright political propaganda piece manufactured by the US military for kids. Well, I guess it's not alone there. Even today, the US military manufactures and sells US Army branded action figures across the US. They're not flying off the shelves by any means, but now as we entered the modern age, the world of propaganda has become more complex and muddled. Where there was a time when propaganda coming straight from the party was easily identifiable, The advent of the internet and social media has nullified the general public's capabilities to identify overt political propaganda, and in the wake of our modern communication mediums, political propaganda has become widely subversive. In the aforementioned book, The Disappearance of Childhood, author Neil Postman essentially makes the claim that childhood as a social role was created by a division in education created by our communication mediums. The concept arose with the invention of the printing press and the spread of mass literacy, and because literacy took years of education to fully learn, there became a distinction between children and adults in terms of knowledge, social roles, and maturity. Before people take to the comments, I'd again like to emphasize his phrasing. Childhood as a social role, not as an aspect of biology. Obviously, children are not physically mature, but for much of our history, as previously discussed, children took on very adult social characteristics: working, smoking, clothes they wore, even in some cases drinking. And as our societies became more literate and more educated, the social role of the child grew even longer, and the divide between children and adults was more and more clear. But this isn't to say that the divide would continue to grow in this way. As technology progressed, so did our communication mediums. The printed word had taken years of education to fully master, but with the invention of the television and now personalized algorithm-ran social media, this distinction is undermined due to the immediate accessibility of images requiring no learning barrier. And because everyone, regardless of age, can access the same images, stories, and information, the distinction between children and adults starts to erode. So why do I bring this up if I'm talking about propaganda specifically targeted at kids and teens? Well, the propaganda itself no longer has to go through the loophole of being easily accessible to kids. Though social media is hosted by large companies, they are not the ones creating the content on their platforms. The rise of user-generated content and influencers presented a plethora of different avenues for US military propaganda to be indirectly targeted at kids and teens. Are you really into cool edits? Here's a cool Sigma edit of US military operatives in the Middle East, highlighting all the cool badass weapons that they were using in the conflict. Not into Sigma edits? Maybe you like guns. Here's 100,000 paramilitary and former military gun channels. I mean, fucking hell, are you into e-girls? Here's an e-girl that's in the army. The list goes on and on and on, but the kicker about all of this is that none of these technically have to be made directly for children, since technically social media platforms are for everyone. But there is one very specific video from a very popular YouTuber I'd also like to talk about. In fact, it's what led me to making this entire video. In a recent upload from everyone's favorite version of the Antichrist, MrBeast, he did a classic formula of going into more and more expensive blanks. In this specific circumstance, it was bunkers. Now, the first few were pretty normal for his standards of a video. Comically expensive versions of something most people will never even see. But the last one was a truly dystopian level of propaganda. For context, in case you didn't know, MrBeast markets himself as a family-friendly, mainly for kids, YouTube channel. He makes wacky, cartoonish videos in crazy places with his cartoonish gang of man-children. He does game shows. He sells chocolate bars. Hell, he even has his own line of children's toys. He has a very clear target audience, both in the US and abroad. Now, the last and quote-unquote most expensive bunker he went into for the video, it was a fucking military base. The Cheyenne Mountain Space Force Command Center, located in Colorado Springs to be exact. And in his video, he called it the $1 billion bunker. So what's the deal? Transformers had army bases. This is different. He talks about how it's designed to survive a nuclear strike, literally showcasing the level of security the bunker has, also making sure to emphasize how heavily guarded and impenetrable it is. He showcases how the bunker is built on a shock-absorbing system, emphasizing the US military hollowed out a mountain to make this. And when they enter, he has his military handler going, "Welcome to the most secure bunker on the planet," as they enter the facility. Then there's my favorite part. Him and his group of man-children go into the literal war room where nukes would be launched, and MrBeast says, to protect America from airborne and maritime attacks, this is where the leaders of NORAD would be calling the shots. I mean, come on. Did a 70-year-old general write this? I'm not exaggerating this either. I'm quoting him word for word. What child knows what NORAD is? This is overt for children. Another portion I like is when they enter the different command center, the AJOC, and he asks a military commander, totally unprompted and of his own accord, if an unknown aircraft were to enter the U.S. airspace, how many minutes until a fighter jet would be trailing him, to which the commander responds, less than 5. The rest of the segment just shows the facilities like the food court, gym, Subway sandwich shop, and the rest of the time they just play firefighter in there. And it is truly one of the most dystopian pieces of modern media I have seen. Having MrBeast and his man-children brigade go play around in a military command center and pass it off like it was just for fun for the video. Now, why, aside from obvious reasons, do I think this is overt political propaganda for kids? Well, in 2023, the Pentagon, heart of the DoD, approved funding for a MrBeast humanitarian aid video in Puerto Rico. This video never materialized, but what this does tell us is that there is a real established connection and communication channel between MrBeast and the Department of Defense, the U.S. military. In our current world, our established communication systems have created quite the ecosystem of military propaganda for children, and I don't think it's going to lighten up anytime soon. So the next time you're watching some seemingly innocent piece of media and there's a weird amount of U.S. military presence in it, remember that you might be watching some U.S. military propaganda for kids. Thank you for watching. If you're still here, consider liking and subscribing so I can fill your brain with my own propaganda. I know this video was pretty broad, but I hope it got the point across how present this really is now. Bye-bye.